Number 3. Orey Steinmann. In February 2004, 17-year-old Orey Torres and some friends were playing on a computer in their school in Los Angeles, California. At some point, they started using Google to look up random things. Then someone got the idea to look up Orey's name because it was so unusual. Orey told his friends to look him up using his father's last name, which is Steinmann. Orey's mother told him that his father had abandoned them when he was just a toddler. When they searched the name Orey Steinmann, Orey was disturbed by one of the first links that came up. It was a Canadian website for missing children. They went to the website, and there was a picture of Orey as a toddler. According to the website, Orey went missing from Red Deer, Alberta, 14 years earlier. After finding himself on the missing child's website, Orey told a teacher. The teacher then got in contact with the Missing Children Society of Canada, who launched an immediate investigation. It turned out that Orey's parents, Giselle Goudreau and Rodney Steinmann, started dating in the summer of 1985. After a few months, Giselle became pregnant. She told Rodney about the pregnancy, and they had talked about her getting an abortion. Then they stopped seeing each other. Rodney thought that Giselle had gone through with the abortion. So nearly 2 years later, he was surprised when she introduced to him his 1.5-year-old son, Orey. After learning he had a son, Rodney and Giselle started dating again, but it didn't last long. After they broke up, they got into a nasty custody battle. In May 1989, when Orey was 3, a judge granted full custody to Rodney. A few days after that, Rodney dropped off Orey at Giselle's home. When he went to pick him up again, Giselle and Orey were gone. So Rodney reported Orey kidnapped. First, Giselle and Orey went to Mexico, and then they moved to Los Angeles. Giselle got a job as an administrative assistant for the Los Angeles District School Board, and she enrolled Orey in school. Just over 14 years later, Orey's friends Googled him, and he learned that he was kidnapped. After the teacher contacted the Missing Children Society of Canada, authorities in the United States and Canada spent a year working on the extradition process. Then on February 11, 2004, Giselle was arrested, and Orey was placed with a foster family in California. Giselle was held for 4 months in jail while awaiting extradition to Canada. In January 2012, she was sentenced to 2 months in prison. After Giselle was arrested, Rodney was notified that his son was found alive and well. Rodney said he was overjoyed to learn that his son was still alive, but nothing would ever replace the 15 years that they lost. Number 2. Barbara Mackle. In the fall of 1968, 20-year-old Barbara Mackle was attending Emory College in Atlanta, Georgia. Barbara's father, Robert Mackle, was a wealthy real estate developer. He ran a multi-million-dollar real estate corporation with his 2 brothers. Their most notable accomplishment was developing Deltona Lakes, Florida, which later became the city of Deltona. Less than 2 weeks before Christmas 1968, Barbara had come down with the flu. Barbara's mother, Jane, flew from their home in Coral Gables, Florida, to Atlanta to take care of Barbara. On December 14, 1968, they checked into a motel so Barbara wouldn't get her roommate sick. 2 days later, Barbara was feeling better, and she and her mother planned to fly home after her last exam. But that wouldn't happen. At about 4 a.m. on December 17th, there was a loud knock at the door of their motel room. It startled the mother and daughter out of sleep. Jane went to the door and asked who was there. It was a man who said he was with the police, and he told her that Barbara's boyfriend had been in a car accident. When Jane opened the door, two people wearing ski masks pushed their way in. One of them was carrying an assault rifle. They tied Jane up and put a rag doused in chloroform over her airways. After she had passed out, the masked people led Barbara out to a car and made her get in. They drove 20 miles north to a wooded area near Duluth, Georgia. When they got to the wooded area, the driver turned onto an off-road path and drove for about 100 yards. Then they got Barbara out of the car and they showed her where they would be holding her. It was a wooden box that was sitting in a hole in the ground. It was made of plywood and the inside was lined with fiberglass. It was about 3 feet wide, 3.5 feet deep, and 7 feet long. One of the kidnappers explained that there was enough food and water for several days. There was also a fan that would move air around, and there were 2 plastic pipes that went out of the coffin-like box. The kidnapper said that this would give her oxygen so she wouldn't suffocate to death. Finally, there was a lamp that was battery-powered. At first, Barbara refused to get into the capsule. She begged her kidnappers not to put her in it. When Barbara wouldn't get into the box, they put a rag soaked in chloroform over her mouth and her nose until she was drowsy. Then they physically forced her to get into the box. When she was lying down, they made her hold a sign that said "Kidnapped," and they snapped this Polaroid photograph. Then they closed the capsule with Barbara in it, and they started to pile hundreds of pounds of dirt and clay onto it. Barbara screamed and pleaded with them not to leave her there, but her kidnappers didn't listen. Through the pipe, she heard them stop burying her. Then she heard them get into their car and drive away. Barbara was left alone under 2 feet of clay and dirt, and within minutes, she knew that she would never be able to get out of the capsule by herself. About 3 hours after she was buried alive, the lamp died, and she was left in complete darkness. Meanwhile, the kidnappers set in motion a plan to get a ransom. The mastermind of the kidnapping was 23-year-old Gary Chris, who worked as a research assistant at SeaWorld. Chris was born in Alaska, and he grew up in Utah. When he was young, he committed petty crimes, like robberies. He always dreamed of pulling off one big job. In the autumn of 1968, Chris decided it was time to follow his dream. He wanted to kidnap a rich young woman and hold her for ransom. Chris had done his graduate studies at the University of Miami's Institute of Marine Science. It was there that he met a woman named Ruth Eisemann-Schier. Eisemann-Schier was the daughter of Austrian Jewish parents who fled Nazi persecution and ended up in Honduras. Eisemann-Schier was born and raised in Honduras, and then she attended the University of Mexico. After she graduated, she went to the University of Miami's Institute of Marine Science to do her master's. Chris and Eisemann-Schier became romantically involved, and at some point, he told her about his plan to kidnap a wealthy young woman and hold her for ransom. Eisemann-Schier agreed to help him any way she could. Chris compiled a list of over 100 potential young women they could kidnap. He wanted a strong and confident woman who would be mentally able to handle being buried alive in the box. He found out about Barbara after her father made the news because President Richard Nixon had purchased some homes from her father. After the purchase, her father and Nixon became friends. On the same day that Jane arrived in Atlanta to help nurse Barbara through her illness, Chris and Eisemann-Schier came to Atlanta to kidnap Barbara. First, Chris and Eisemann-Schier went to Barbara's dorm room and found out that she had gone to a motel with her mother. They watched the motel, and they figured out which room Jane and Barbara were in. Then early on the morning of December 18th, Chris and Eisemann-Schier wore ski masks and got into their motel room. Eisemann-Schier knocked Jane out with the chloroform. Then they forced Barbara to get into the car and drove her to the woods where they buried her. When Jane regained consciousness, she was able to call for help, and Barbara was reported kidnapped. After burying Barbara, Chris called the Mackle home. A friend of the family answered the phone, and Chris told him that there was a note buried in the Mackle's backyard. At this point, the FBI was involved in the case. An agent went into the yard, and he found the note. The note said that Barbara was alive, and she was buried in an underground capsule. They would learn the location of the capsule if they paid $500,000 in ransom, which is about $3.6 million in 2018. The note said that Barbara had enough food, water, and air to survive for 7 days. If Robert didn't give them the money, or if they were arrested, they simply wouldn't reveal the location of where Barbara was buried, and she would die. The $500,000 was to be paid in used $20 bills, and the money was to be placed into a suitcase. Once they had the money collected, they were to phone the newspapers in Miami and have them publish the following ad in their classified section. "Loved one, please come home. We will pay all expenses and meet you anywhere, at any time. Your family." After the classified ads were published, the kidnapper would call with directions as to what to do with the money. The kidnapper then wrote that they would never find Barbara unless he told them where she was buried. After the ransom note was found, Robert got to work collecting the money, and then he placed the classified ads. The ads appeared in several newspapers the day after Barbara was kidnapped. Later that night, Chris called the Mackle home with instructions on where to drop the money. Robert was to leave the suitcase full of money along the seawall at the Fair Isles Causeway, which wasn't far from the Mackle home. Robert did as he was instructed, and he dropped the money. But Chris had problems picking up the suitcase full of cash. Chris waited for Robert to drop off the suitcase in a boat not far from the drop point. He was supposed to row the boat to shore, grab the suitcase, and then go to the car that was driven by Eisemann-Schier. But he ran into problems minutes after he reached land. As he walked to the drop point, he got lost because it was dark. He picked up the money an hour later than he was supposed to. After picking up the money, he started walking to the car where Eisemann-Schier was waiting. As Chris got close to the car, he encountered two police officers who weren't part of the kidnapping investigation and just happened to be in the area while they were on patrol. Chris and Eisemann-Schier thought that the officers were there to arrest them for kidnapping, so they ran and left their car behind. When they ran, the police chased after them. While fleeing, Chris dropped the suitcase. Chris and Eisemann-Schier were able to get away, but they left a lot of evidence in the car that they ran away from. This included their passports and their checkbooks. There were also Polaroid pictures of themselves and the photograph of Barbara holding up the kidnap sign. After the botched money pickup, Chris and Eisemann-Schier decided to split up, and they would meet up again in Texas in a few days. Eisemann-Schier left town immediately, while Chris decided to risk another money exchange. That night, Chris called the Mackle home and told Robert where to drop the money. This time, Chris was able to get the money, and he walked away with it. After Chris collected the money, he called the FBI and told them where to find Barbara. Over 100 agents descended on the area. Some of them started digging with their bare hands. Not long after arriving, they found Barbara. After being buried alive for 83 hours, besides being dehydrated, she was in good health, both mentally and physically. She was flown home on her father's private jet. When the plane landed, she spoke to the press for about 45 seconds. She said that her kidnappers had treated her humanely. Since Christ and Eisemann-Schier left so much evidence in the car, the FBI knew that they were the kidnappers. They were both placed on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. Chris decided the best way to get to Texas was by boat. So he purchased a new motorboat using the ransom money, and he set off towards Texas. By this time, Barbara's kidnapping was big news, and the fact that the ransom was paid in 20s was made public. Since Chris bought the boat in 20s, the man who sold him it thought it was suspicious, so he called the police. About 24 hours after Barbara was rescued, Chris was located off the coast of South Florida. Chris jumped off his boat and tried to swim to shore, but he was pulled out of the water and he was arrested. Ruth Eisemann-Schier was arrested 2 days later in Norman, Oklahoma. Gary Chris was convicted of kidnapping and he was given a life sentence. In May 1969, Eisemann-Schier pleaded guilty to kidnapping and she was sentenced to 7 years in prison. She served 4 years in prison and then she was paroled on the condition that she would move back to Honduras. Besides the 45 seconds that she spoke to the press after she was rescued, Barbara didn't sit down for a public interview or do any TV appearances. But she did co-write a book with a reporter from the Miami Herald. The book, entitled 83 Hours Till Dawn, was published just 2 years after the abduction in 1971. The book was made into 2 TV movies. One was released in 1972 and the other one aired in 1990. Other than the book, Barbara Mackle has stayed out of the public eye. The mastermind of the kidnapping, Gary Chris, also wrote a book about the abduction. It's titled Life, The Man Who Kidnapped Barbara Jane Mackle, and it was published a year after Barbara's book was released. Chris served 10 years in prison, then in 1989 he was paroled. After he got out of prison, he studied to become a medical doctor. In the summer of 2001, he got a medical license in Iowa. He worked as a general practitioner in Krisny, Iowa for about 2 years. Then in 2003, his medical license was revoked because he didn't tell the medical board that he had been disciplined when he was a resident. 3 years later, in March 2006, Chris was arrested again. On his boat, he had tried to smuggle 4 people from South America into the United States. Also on the boat, the police found more than 30 pounds of cocaine, which had a street value of $1 million. In his backyard, the police found a cocaine processing lab. It was an underground lab hidden under his shed. Chris pleaded guilty to drug smuggling, and in May 2006, he was sentenced to 5 years and 5 months in prison. He was paroled in November 2010, but he was arrested again in August 2012 after he violated his parole by sailing to Cuba. For the violation, he was given another 40 months in prison. Since that last arrest, Gary Chris has stayed out of the public eye. Number 1. Colleen Stan. On May 19, 1977, 20-year-old Colleen Stan left her home in Eugene, Oregon with her roommates, and her roommates dropped her off near the freeway. When she got to the freeway, she stuck out her thumb, looking for a ride. She was going to a friend's birthday party in Westwood, California. Not long after she got to the freeway, someone picked her up and drove her part of the way. Then she got out and started looking for another ride. Someone picked her up and drove her to Red Bluff, California, which is about 85 miles west of Westwood. She stuck out her thumb, and a few minutes later, a car full of guys offered her a ride. She didn't think it was the safest choice, so she turned them down. Then a couple stopped and offered her a ride, but they weren't heading towards Westwood. Then a blue Ford Colt pulled over. In the car was a couple who appeared to be around the same age as her. The woman was holding a baby girl in her arms. Colleen thought that the couple seemed normal, so she got into the back seat. But the couple was far from normal. The man was Cameron Hooker, and he was 23 years old. The woman holding the baby was his 19-year-old wife, Janice Hooker. Cameron Hooker was born in Alturas, California in November 1953. When he was a kid, his family moved around a lot, and then they settled in Red Bluffs, California when he was 16. Besides moving around frequently, Cameron had a peaceful childhood. He was not abused, and his family was, by all accounts, a happy one. Cameron later said that he didn't ever remember his parents getting into a fight. He was a gawky teenager and a bit of a loner in high school. In school, he did well in shop class, but he barely passed his other classes. Nevertheless, he graduated from high school and he got a job at a local lumber mill. When he was 19, he was introduced to Janice, who was 15 and in the 9th grade. Janice's parents were never around much, and she was mostly raised by her sister. Her father worked long hours, and she said he was cold and distant. Her mother was strict, and Janice felt like she could never do anything right. Not long after they were introduced to each other, Cameron and Janice started dating. A few months into the relationship, Cameron asked Janice if he could hang her naked by her wrists from a tree. She agreed to do that for him. So one day they drove out to the mountains, and Cameron hung her from a tree branch with leather straps. Janice didn't like it, but Cameron did. He got her down, and he was very loving and tender afterward, and Janice really liked that part. Since he was so nice and loving afterward, she decided to keep letting him commit acts of sadomasochism on her. This included being tied up and whipped. One time, she agreed to let Cameron hold her head underwater in a creek while they were having sex. She nearly drowned, and then she really began to dislike their rough sex life. They got married when Janice was 16 years old and Cameron was 20. They moved into a house in Red Bluff, California. After the wedding, the abuse got to be more elaborate and terrifying. Within months of getting married, Janice started to say no to Cameron's requests. Around that time, Cameron started talking about kidnapping and keeping a slave. Cameron told Janice that if he had a slave, then he would stop abusing her. In late 1975, Janice found out she was pregnant, and then she thought it would be a good idea for Cameron to get a slave. On January 31st, 1976, they came across 19-year-old Maria Sponicky, who was hitchhiking. They took her back home where Cameron tied her up, sexually assaulted, and tortured her for a day. But she kept screaming and fighting him, so he strangled her to death. Afterward, he buried her near Lassen Park, which is about 60 miles from their home. In the fall of 1976, Janice gave birth to a daughter. About half a year later, on May 19, 1977, Cameron was driving home and he passed a woman hitchhiking. He went home and picked up Janice and his daughter. Then they went back and picked up the woman. She told them that her name was Colleen Stan. Shortly after picking her up, they stopped off at a gas station and Colleen went into the washroom. When she got back to the car, the family wasn't in it. She got into the back seat and then she noticed an odd wooden cube on the seat beside her. Each side was about 1 square foot. Suddenly, Cameron entered the car and held a large knife to Colleen's throat. He then handcuffed her wrists behind her back and put a blindfold over her eyes. Then he picked up the wooden box. There were hinges on the box so it could open up. On the bottom, there were 2 half circles cut into both sides of the opening of the box. The man opened the box and placed it over Colleen's head. He closed the box and the hole at the bottom clamped around her neck. The neck hole was a bit too small, so it partially strangled her. The box weighed around 20 pounds. Inside the box was a series of straps that kept it in place on her head. One strap covered her mouth so she couldn't talk or breathe out of it. The interior of the cube was lined with carpet, and the crevices were filled with foam. This made the box pitch black inside, and it blocked out almost all sound. The only thing Colleen could hear was her own breathing, which had become very difficult to do in the enclosed box. Cameron and Janice drove around for a while, with Colleen lying down in the back seat with the box on her head. When it was dark, Cameron drove home and took the head box off Colleen. He led Colleen, who was blindfolded, into the basement of their home. In the basement, Cameron used a leather strap and cuffs to hang Colleen by her wrist from a beam in the ceiling of the basement. Then Cameron went and got Janice, and they had sex under Colleen while she hung from the ceiling. Cameron took a break to whip Colleen, and they went back to be with his wife. When they were done having sex, Janice went upstairs, and Cameron got Colleen down. He then led her to a crate, and her arms were chained above her. He put the head box back on her and locked it. She was kept that way for a few hours. Then Cameron came back downstairs and took her out of the crate. He strapped her to a homemade rack, and he left her there all night. The next night, Cameron came back into the basement, and once again, he hung Colleen by her wrists. When he was done with her, he tied her to the rack, and the head box was locked onto her head. For 23 hours, she remained on the rack, with the box that blocked out most of her senses locked on her head. The same routine continued for another few days. For 23 hours a day, she was strapped to the rack with the box on her head. During these first few days, Colleen learned the rules of her captivity. Basically, she had to obey every command Cameron gave her. For a week, Colleen would remain tied to the rack with the head box on for 23 hours a day. She would be taken off the rack so she could eat one meal, have one glass of water, and use a bedpan. Then she was tortured for the remainder of the hour. Then a week after she was kidnapped, Cameron built something that was effectively Colleen's new home. It was a coffin-like box made from particle board. The box was 6.5 feet long, 2.5 feet wide, and 20 inches tall. Cameron didn't force her to wear the head box in the coffin, but to drown out sound, he put wax in her ears. He also chained her from her neck to her ankles. The chain wasn't very long, so her back was always bent and she could never straighten out her body. This left a constant ache in her back. For 7 months, this was Colleen Stan's life. She was fed twice a day, and she was able to use her bedpan once a day. She would also be taken out of the box for about an hour every day to be beaten and whipped. Cameron usually hung her by her wrists from the ceiling and whipped her with a bullwhip. Other times he used a cat o' nine tails leather whip. Later he would choke, hang, or drown her until she was near death and then stop. 3 months into her captivity, Colleen took her first bath. She had hair that went down to her waist, but it had to be cut off at her shoulders because it was so knotted and matted. After that, she was allowed to bathe once a month. About 8 months into her captivity, Cameron built her a workshop in the basement. Every night while Cameron and Janice slept, Colleen was locked up in the workshop and she was given different tasks to complete. For example, she would have to crack all the nuts in a sack, or sand wood, or do macrame or crochet projects. Colleen assumed that her projects were being sold. Then on January 25, 1978, 7 months into Colleen's captivity, Cameron made Colleen sign a contract saying she was volunteering to be a slave. Cameron said that a man from the company needed the contract. Cameron said that the company was an underground network of rich and powerful men who buy, trade, and keep women enslaved. If she were to ever escape, the company would catch her and they would punish her by torturing and killing her family. Every night for several weeks, Cameron talked to her about the company and what it would do to her and her family if she escaped. After a while, Colleen believed that the company was real and very dangerous. Once she believed that the company was real, she was given a bit more freedom. She was allowed to leave the basement to do chores, like clean up after the family and wash their dishes. During her captivity, Cameron had not raped her. That changed in February 1987, about 8 months after he kidnapped her. After the assault, Colleen immediately sensed anger and hatred from Janice. At the end of April 1978, near the end of Colleen's first year of captivity, Cameron and Janice moved from their house into a mobile home in Red Bluff. When they moved, Cameron moved Colleen with them. He had constructed another box for her. This one was slightly smaller than the other one. It was 6 feet long, 33 inches wide, and 15 inches tall, and it opened like a coffin. When Cameron wasn't using Colleen, she was stored in the coffin, and the coffin was hidden under his and Janice's waterbed. Once again, she would be kept in the box for 23 hours a day. She would be let out to have a glass of water, cold leftovers, and to empty her bedpan, which she was allowed to keep in the box with her. If there was cleaning to do around the home, or Cameron wanted to torture her, she would stay out of the box longer. Sometime in the late spring of 1978, for the first time in a year, Colleen was allowed to wear clothes, and she was allowed to go outside during the day. She was taken outside to do hard labor, like dig holes. In the summer, she was allowed outside to do some gardening. Over the next year, Colleen continued to live in the coffin under the waterbed. In September of 1978, Janice gave birth to a second daughter. Cameron delivered the baby himself. Janice gave birth on the waterbed, while Colleen was locked in the box below it. Nearly 2 years into Colleen's captivity, in April 1979, Janice got a job at a fast food restaurant. She worked the evening shift. When she was at work, Colleen was in charge of making dinner and cleaning up afterward. She made Cameron steak and potatoes, while she had to eat rice and oatmeal. Once Janice started working, Cameron began to sexually assault Colleen once or twice a week. Colleen slowly started to get more freedom, and she would even talk with the neighbors, but she never tried to escape. She was sure that if she did escape, the company would find her and kill her family. In 1980, Janice got a different job where she worked during the day. So Colleen was let out of the coffin during the day to watch Cameron and Janice's daughters. Even though she was left alone most of the day, Colleen did not try to escape out of fear that the company would kill her and her family. By her 3rd anniversary, she was spending less time in the coffin. Instead, she was forced to sleep on the floor in the living room with a collar around her neck. The collar was attached to a chain, and the chain was wrapped around the toilet. Sometimes, both Cameron and Janice would take her out for excursions. One time, Janice took her to a bar, and they went home with 2 men. During Colleen's 3rd year as a slave, Cameron let her call home and talk with her sister. Colleen told her sister that she was fine, and she was staying with some friends up north. Colleen's family had been looking for her, and they were concerned about her safety. They traced the call to a payphone in Chico, California. But tracing the call didn't lead them to Colleen. After that initial call, Colleen was allowed to call her dad a few times, and she sent 2 letters home. Then in March 1981, 2 months shy of the 4th anniversary of the kidnapping, Cameron decided to test Colleen. He took her outside, and he handed her a shotgun. He told her to put the barrel in her mouth and pull the trigger. She did as she was told, and she pulled the trigger. The gun was not loaded. This proved to Cameron that Colleen was unwavering in her submission to him. So he gave her a special reward. She would be allowed to spend 24 hours with her family. Cameron drove her and dropped her off at her father's home in Los Angeles. Her family didn't ask her where she had been for the past 4 years. Based on the paleness of her skin, her weight loss, and her homemade clothes, they thought she had joined a cult. When Cameron picked her up again, he went into Colleen's father's home and introduced himself to her family. He said his name was Mike, and he said he was Colleen's fiancé. Colleen's sister was suspicious of Cameron, and she asked him to take a picture of him and Colleen. Cameron agreed, and Colleen wrapped her arms around him and smiled for the camera. Then Cameron got Colleen into his car, and they drove back home. During her visit, Colleen did not tell anyone that she had been kidnapped and she was being held captive. Colleen's visit to her family marked the climax of her freedom. When they returned to the mobile home, Colleen was forced to spend her days locked in the coffin that was so dark that she couldn't see her hand in front of her face. She was allowed to come out of the coffin for a few hours after Cameron and Janice's daughters went to bed. This was Colleen's routine for the next 3 years. Colleen was so well hidden that Cameron and Janice's kids thought that Colleen had moved away. At times, when she was locked in the coffin, temperatures would reach over 120 degrees. But if Colleen made a noise, let alone complain, she was physically punished. In May 1984, after 3 long years of spending a majority of her days in the coffin under the bed, and 7 years after she was kidnapped, Colleen was once again allowed out of the box, and she was able to venture outside the mobile home. After she was allowed to leave the mobile home again, one of Cameron and Janice's neighbors offered her a job as a motel maid, and Cameron gave her permission to take the job. Of course, any money that Colleen made went directly to Cameron. Colleen was even brought on a family vacation with Cameron, Janice, and their 2 daughters. On August 9, 1984, Colleen was cleaning a motel room, and Janice walked in. Janice told Colleen that the company was real, but Cameron was not a member of it. Colleen said she never found out why Janice told her that, but she realized that after 7 years and 2 months, she was free. She called her father and asked him to wire her some money so she could take a bus to his house. He sent her the money, and on August 11th, Janice dropped Colleen off at the bus station in Red Bluff. Colleen got on a bus heading to Los Angeles, and Janice took her 2 daughters to stay with her parents. Once Colleen got to her father's home, she told her family that she had been kidnapped and held as a slave for the past 7 years. They told her to go to the police, but she didn't want to just yet. Before she left, Janice made her promise not to go to the police because she wanted to give Cameron a chance to change his ways. A few days after Colleen left, Janice moved back in with Cameron. She told him that if his behavior improved, Colleen would come back. In the 3 months after she escaped, Colleen called Cameron and Janice's home 29 times. Then in early November, Janice realized that Cameron would probably never change, and she went to the police. At first, the police didn't believe her, especially considering that Colleen didn't report the kidnapping. So the police interviewed Colleen, and she confirmed a lot of the details. On November 18, 1984, just over 3 months after Colleen escaped, Cameron Hooker was arrested, and he was charged with kidnapping and sexual assault. He went to trial at the end of September 1985. Cameron said he was innocent and Colleen had volunteered to be a slave. Cameron testified, and he pointed to the pictures of Colleen smiling with him and his family as evidence that she wasn't being held against her will. He also said that Colleen talked to his neighbors, she had a job at a motel, and she was even allowed to visit her family. If she was really being held against her will, why didn't she use any of those opportunities to escape? In exchange for immunity, Janice testified against Cameron. She testified that they kidnapped and held Colleen captive. Then Colleen testified, and she told the court about her 7 years and 2 months of isolation and torture. Cameron was ultimately found guilty on 15 of the 16 counts. The jury was deadlocked on the final count, which was one of the many sex crimes that Cameron was charged with. Cameron Hooker was sentenced to 104 years in prison, and initially he would have been able to apply for parole in 2023. But due to prison overcrowding, he was able to apply for parole in 2015. His request for parole was denied. He will be able to apply again in 2022 when he's 68 years old. After she was free, Colleen said she learned to appreciate the small things in life. This includes waking up in the middle of the night and knowing that she's in bed, and being able to cook and eat what she wants. Colleen went on to get a degree in accounting, and she got married and had a daughter. She currently lives in California. Cameron Hooker was never charged with the murder of Marie Sponicky. Sponicky's body has never been found, and Cameron is the only suspect in her disappearance. Thank you so much for watching today's video. Hopefully you found it interesting. If you did, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe for more videos just like it. Also, please go to criminallylisted.com where you can suggest cases, buy merch, and find out about an exclusive podcast. But that's all for today. Thanks again for watching.